Can you hear me?
Good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon. So why don't we start? Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session. And I'm He Fan from Shanghai Jiao Tong University. And joined with me today is Martin Wolf, the Chief Economics Commentator of Financial Times. And the topic of this session is the global economic challenges on the road to 2031, 10 years later. So I think we cannot find a better guest like Martin, because for decades he's a close observer of the up and down of globalization. I have quite a lot of questions for Martin, but we only have 30 minutes, so I'll come straight to the questions. So Martin, let's start it with a recent event at the strategic dialogue between China and the United States, which just ended at Anchorage, Alaska. And we can sense the tension at the opening statement, which is quite unusual. But maybe they have made some deal at the following closed-door negotiation. I hope so. And for me, it's a signal which shows probably down the track there will be some dramatic change of the Sino-US relationship. I don't know, what's your opinion? How do you see that in the future? What will be in your view, what will be the best scenario, or what will be the worst scenario between the two big powers? Yeah.
Well, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here, even if it's very early in the morning for me. And on a Saturday. So since we only have 30 minutes, I can only discuss this very, very briefly. Mm-hmm. It seems to now quite obvious that in recent years, it really started under the Obama administration, but obviously went much further under the Trump administration, and now under the Biden administration. Pretty well, there's only one thing the Americans agree on. Mm-hmm. They are divided on everything, as far as I can see, except one thing, which is that China is a serious strategic rival and even threat. And this is a view of economics, where China's impressive rise is seen as a threat to American dominance. It's seen in terms of security, strategic security, particularly now in the Indo-Pacific region, but possibly more broadly. It's seen, I think, to some degree ideologically as a rival in the intellectual sphere. And this is remarkably bipartisan, though the flavor of it will differ between Democrats and Republicans. I am very concerned about this, but I suspect, as many scholars have suggested, this was pretty well inevitable. My friend Graham Allison wrote the famous book, The Thucydides Trap, and as he points out, these competitions have occurred many times in the past at the world stage. So you asked, what is the best thing and what is the worst thing that could happen? Well, the best thing would be that a modus vivendi, a way of dealing with one another, is worked out that allows world trade to continue, that allows reasonably productive relationships to occur, and above all, allows cooperation in essential globally shared tasks like managing climate change, like managing pandemics, like stabilizing the world economy. That would be the best thing. I think that's still possible. And the worst thing will be outright conflict, a breakdown in relations, decoupling the division of the world into segmented spheres of influence, which, given the deep integration of the two countries with one another, with the world, would be extremely destructive economically and make cooperation impossible. And of course, at the very, very worst, there would be military conflict. So those are the options. And I think which of them it will be and how it's managed will almost certainly be the most important geopolitical and geoeconomic issue of the coming decade. So, and much longer than that.
Okay. So do you see a situation similar to the Cold War, you know, the between United States and Russia, between China and the United States in the future? Or?
I suppose I think the answer is no and yes. It's a bit more complicated. Well, first of all, we have to say, in retrospect, if we look back on the 20th century, there were two world wars and a Cold War. And of the three, the Cold War was much the least bad, because despite very severe differences and frictions and very dangerous moments, war was avoided and it ended more or less peacefully. So we could have worse things than a Cold War, is what I'm saying. But I think it would be very difficult to have anything quite like the Cold War. The Cold War was very different in important respects. First of all, the Soviet Union and its allies and the West really were not economically integrated at all. They were completely separated economically, geographically, largely, with competition limited largely to developing countries, which were also not very integrated to the world economy. So it didn't have a large economic effect. This is very, very different. Second, of course, the two sides, if you can use the sides now, are much more evenly matched economically in terms of resources than the Cold War was between the Soviet Union and the West, in which, in truth, the West was enormously much more economically powerful than the Soviet Union throughout. There's no doubt about it, which in the end is why it won. This would not be the case in the same way between the West and China, not now and even less in future. Third, I think in the Cold War there was a very clear ideological split. The Soviet Union had a very I think expansionist view of its ideology as a global ideology. The ideological differences in this case are important, but it seems to me much less so. China is a very different country from the former Soviet Union. It is a very complex civilization with a mixture of political centralization and economic decentralization, which is quite difficult for us fully to understand, but it makes it very different from the Soviet Union. So the answer is, in some ways, it could be like the Cold War. It could be worse. It could be much. We could have worse things than the Cold War, as I've said. But it seems to me that a breakdown will be far more difficult to manage because of the degree of integration than the Cold War relationship that emerged after the Second World War. Will be far more difficult to manage, and it ought to be avoidable. But at the moment, it's not clear that it will be avoided.
It will be much more complicated, huh?
Much more complicated.
Yeah. So we have talked about climate change, and China recently announced a very ambitious goal. China is going to be carbon neutral before 2060. And what's your take of this policy? So in this area, how do you see that? will this be one area that China and the United States can cooperate with each other and deal with these challenges?
I think the answer to that is it would be a very, very good thing for the world and for them if they could cooperate. Climate change is clearly a huge challenge for humanity. And it is a process that, at least within the timetable of humans, is irreversible. So if we make very big mistakes in this century, as I see it, the consequences will reverberate on our planet for possibly thousands of years. And they will continue to worsen as ice sheets melt, sea levels rise, weather change. So this is a tremendous challenge. And it's one that our generation and the ones immediately afterwards have to solve. It is an obligation we have to our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and the future of the planet. So it must be solved. And I would say it can only be solved, and politicians have to understand this, if everybody that matters cooperates. And clearly the West, particularly the US and China, are at the moment dominant players in terms of emissions. Between them, they contribute, I think, something like 70 to 75% of global emissions, China being much the biggest. So they have to deliver. The only other really important player in the future will be India, which will have to obviously participate because it's so large. And so it has to be done. I am an optimistic pessimist. I'm optimistic in the sense that I think many people, not all, have begun to realize the significance of the challenge. Even ordinary people, politicians, the skeptics have largely lost the battle. I think the Chinese, like most sensible Americans, not all, unfortunately, recognize the challenge. But it's a tremendous challenge. It requires a lot of change. And it has to be said, the Americans have been very reluctant to do much. After all, President Trump withdrew from the Paris Accord. It's never been a central element in actual American policy, and it's still very divided in America. It's not clear what would happen if or when the Republicans return. And of course, for China, the promise they've made is very far in the future. You're promising what will happen 40 years from now or 30 years from now. Now, China obviously is capable of long-term planning, but this is a promise that is made of things that will happen presumably under different people, different leadership, different, who knows. So, as I said, I'm a pessimistic optimist. It's a optimistic pessimist, whatever round. It's a tremendous challenge. I hope it will be delivered upon. I tend to think it probably won't. But I hope that the Chinese will now put in place the policies and instruments that will get to this target. Personally, I think 2060 is a bit late, and it's very important how we get to 2060. It's no good if it all happens in the last 10 years, because by then China will have emitted so much it will be difficult to reverse. And I would like to see, to me, the more interesting challenge is to see what China will do in the next 10 to 15 years.
Okay. I think I will be more optimistic than you regarding China's policy, because, at 2060, China will still be under the leadership of Chinese Communist Party. So we can continue determined to move on and at this policy and this direction. Martin, let's talk about another topic, the monetary policy. What puzzles me is, in the 1990s and early 21st century, what economists call the great moderation, that you see a relatively high economic growth, but at the same time, inflation is very low. Many people say, well, this is because the IT technology and the globalization, and also China's massive saving, which put down the interest rate globally. And after the global financial crisis in 2008, there's no dramatic technology revolution. There's a backlash of globalization, and central banks are using all unconditional monetary policy, pumping money into the market, but still there's no inflation. And so and now some people started to worry about the coming back of this inflationary pressure. Commodity price will increase, and maybe when we finally control this pandemic, and the demand will increase. So what's your view on this topic? Will you see that in the future there will be the coming back of inflation, and what will be the response of central banks of the major economies?
Well, clearly in macroeconomics, this is the most interesting question at the moment. And to answer it without going back over what's happened in the last 40 years, which I discussed to some extent in the book I wrote on the crisis called The Shifts and the Shocks, which I think was even published in China.
Yeah.
I would say at the moment, so just look at where we are now, that there is a shorter term challenge and a somewhat medium to long term challenge in terms of inflation. So the short term challenge is, as you said, we came out of the financial crisis, global demand was fairly weak relative to potential supply. And really all over the world, interestingly, including China, in order to generate demand, there was a very large debt expansion. I've tended to argue that somewhere in the world, at every stage in the last 30 years, some major economy has had to accumulate a lot of internal debt to generate demand. And I can discuss why. Basically, I think it's the byproduct of the savings glut. And it was China more recently, interestingly, which did this. Now, we then have the pandemic, which was another huge contractionary shock. And to support people through the pandemic, we ran very large fiscal deficits, which were supported also by the central banks. And unlike after the financial crisis, the monetary expansion of the central banks has this time been so large as to expand enormously aggregate money supply in the hands of the public, broad money. This was not true after the financial crisis, which I was never worried about inflation then, being a little bit of a monetarist. And of course, in addition, after the financial crisis, fiscal policy tightened quite quickly, and never reached for long periods the sort of fiscal deficits we've seen now. So we've got the combination of a recovering economy, lots of savings in the hands of households, huge savings in the hands of households, the likelihood of a large consumer boom because people can spend, and immense fiscal and monetary support. I think that creates the most likely situation, not certain, the most likely situation for a short run, year 2, 3, 4 year rise in inflation that we've had since the 1970s. And I'm not the only one who thinks this, as is well known. Larry Summers thinks this too. And that would certainly create problems because traditionally, if that's the case, monetary policy will have to tighten more than people think,
Yeah.
even though they want inflation to rise. And there's a lot of debt around. And if that happens, there could be a lot of bad debt and possibly a recession. So that's the short-term risk. But it doesn't seem to me, maybe too optimistic, that it's going to be this is a temporary macroeconomic boom, might not be so serious. The longer term problem is something that a well-known British economist, Charles Goodhart, has written about, which is the basic macroeconomic conditions for the Great Moderation are finally ending. And what were those conditions? As you said, huge excess savings in China, globalization, and a relative shortage of investment opportunities outside China, particularly in the developed West. Those, I think, were the conditions. And his argument is that will change because China and the West are aging rapidly, so savings will fall. Globalization is weakening. And aging will create a lot of fiscal pressure, which will make it impossible for governments to really reduce their fiscal deficits. And central banks will be under a lot of pressure to keep on monetizing them. And this will create a tendency towards a shift back towards a structural inflationary situation across the world. I'm more skeptical of this for one main reason, which is, I think, in the world he describes, which is a bit like what has been going on in Japan for the last 25 years. Investment will probably be quite weak. That will offset the savings decline, which I think will happen. And even in China, I expect investment will tend to decline over the next 20 years as a share of GDP, as it has been doing. And that means this will not necessarily happen. But there is an interesting question whether we are now moving out of the great moderation macro global situation into something different. So there's a short run danger, which is the post-pandemic danger. And there's this longer run change associated with a shift in the basic structure of the world economy as the impact of China on the world changes in profound ways because China itself is changing.
I still have a long list of questions and new technology, geopolitics, aging society, but because we don't have enough time, so let me ask you one final open questions. We have talked about, always talking about black swans here, black swans there. So in your view, if you're looking at the coming 1 decade, if there's any black swan, what will be those black swans and how can we deal with them? What worries you most?
Yes, when Nicholas Nassim Taleb put forward this proposition, it was never quite clear to me whether a black swan was something, because a black swan was something that nobody had ever experienced before they discovered them, apparently in Australia. Now, if something has really never been experienced, it's very difficult for people to think about it. I think what he means by this is, so I will have interpreted it to be something that is imaginable. So a black swan is imaginable, but never happened. I tend to think that in a different way, that there are low probability imaginable things. They're perfectly imaginable, but we consider them in any given period to be low probability, relatively low probability events. Well, if we think about that over the next 10 years, obviously they may not be low probability. The events to think about are more pandemics, much worse pandemics. I think it's very important to understand that, and I've made this point many times, that the current pandemic is a very, 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 very mild one. So if you compare it with the Spanish flu, it looks as though the global mortality from this might be 2 orders of magnitude smaller relative to the population than the Spanish flu. Well, we could have a much worse pandemic. There have been far worse pandemics in the history of humanity than the Spanish flu, which was mild compared with the Great Plagues. So disease is obviously a very serious risk.
Okay, so that's one risk.
Conflict, which could take the form of cyber war, serious destruction of cyber infrastructure, outright conflict, military conflict is obviously a possibility, catastrophic one, but a possibility. A complete breakdown of the global economy into protectionism, the sort of thing we saw in the 1930s, when the world economy essentially disintegrated completely very quickly. Things like that can happen very quickly. Political upheavals and revolutions are possible. They've happened in the past. That's what happens to humanity. Political stability can never be taken for granted. There's the possibilities of mega-terrorism. That's still something that concerns me a lot, including possibly nuclear terrorism. So there are enough nightmares to think about. And of course, it may turn out that climate change, its effect on the world and on the planet, will be much quicker and worse than we think. There's a lot of worry now among scientists about what's going on in Antarctica. And it may turn out that these ice sheets start moving big time, and the ice on the landmass starts to shift off. That will be pretty exciting. And then, of course, there could be some good black swans. People might decide that the world I've described is too horrible to think about. This is insane. Humanity only has one planet. We better get on with one another and sort everything out in such a way we can live peacefully and sensibly. I regard that as a low probability event, but it'd be a very nice one to have. I think we are in one of those periods in history when the challenges are absolutely enormous. And of course, I didn't mention the possibility of really serious inflation, macro instability, and another Great Depression, worse than the global financial crisis or even the pandemic, perhaps stimulated by a much worse pandemic than the one we've had. So there are enormous challenges. And I think the most important thing I've learned, and I look back on this in the last, what's happened to me in my 50 years as an adult, and that every decade, I look back on this systematically, every decade, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, 2000s, 2010s, something happened that nobody really expected. That, or at least was regarded very low probability. So we have to assume that what we think of as the abnormal is sort of normal. So I think over the next 10 years, very extraordinary things are going to happen, bad or good.
Yeah, so what is certain is uncertainty. Thank you, Martin.
Certain is uncertainty, precisely.
Thank you very much. But because of the tight time constraint, we have to stop here. And I hope that in the very near future, when we can control this pandemic, and we'll welcome you come to Beijing again, and we can meet in person. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great pleasure. It was very enjoyable. Thank you very much.
Hi. Bye-bye.
Bye. Enjoy yourself, Peter.
Hi. Hi, Peter, Mr. Peter Mandelson. Hi, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Oh, so.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Okay. Hi. Good morning. Here, good afternoon, everyone here in this room.
Good afternoon to you.
Okay. Nice to meet you. My name is Zhang Yuye, Director of the Institute of World Economics and Politics from Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And I'm going to raise questions and make some comments with you this afternoon, because the majority of audience in this room are Chinese. So I'm going to raise my questions or make comments in Chinese, Mandarin. It's okay?
Right.
Yeah, we have a very a good simultaneous interpretation here. Okay?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think we have half an hour, don't we, for this?
What?
We have half an hour for this.
Yeah, 30 minutes. 30 minutes.
Okay, well, we'll have to, because your questions are quite long. They're fine.
I'll raise my question very briefly. Okay?
Okay, I mean, the first question is about the European Union.
Yes.
And the UK, yes?
Yes.
I mean, about Europe. Yeah, okay. Hold on, just want to get some water.
Okay, 那我现在说一下我的这个问题啊，就是我的问题呢涉及到这个欧洲。
My question is about Europe and UK and their positions in the world in the future. UK has just made a Brexit, and last year, to fight against COVID-19, the policies of European countries were very segmented or fragmented at first. And many people say that Europe or EU integration is not that consolidated. But then they made a stride ahead. EU passed a 750 billion rejuvenation plan. And this plan was commented as a big stride towards European integration. In the past, there was the Euro, the European Bank, but there is a lacking of a leg, that is in the finance and the fiscal integration. But this time, the pandemic has led to the fiscal integration. So people say that in the future, United States, Europe, and China will be the three dominant powers of the world.
I just raise my questions to the audience in this room in Chinese. So please, the first question.
Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to talk about where Europe is going, the state of its integration, and of course where the United Kingdom is going, having left the European Union. I think you have to see the European Union as already being an independent economic superpower in view of its market size, its combined GDP, its presence and weight in the international trading system, and its regulatory power. I don't think that you would see Europe as being quite in the full measure superpower that China and the United States are, because both are greater military powers, with China trying hard to catch up with the United States militarily. But the reason why it's important to see the European Union in this light is because the European Union increasingly likes to see itself as strategically autonomous.
a geopolitical player, a very serious multilateral player in the international system, one that is not dependent on or a supplicant towards either the United States or China. Europe wants to promote its self-reliance in technology, industrial policy, green energy, digital infrastructure, in trade defense, and investment screening. Now, this desire for autonomy or self-reliance has been increased by the pandemic during the last year. Europe does not want to depend on other countries for the supply of essential goods. But at the same time, the pandemic has strengthened Europe's belief in effective multilateral action and cooperation. Now, while promoting its strategic autonomy, the European Union will also seize the opportunity presented by the Biden administration to push for greater global policy collaboration, for example, on digital governance, including on data sharing and taxation. Now, we should not be naive about the prospects of success in coordinating global policies. It's very hard, it's very challenging. In areas such as digital privacy, artificial intelligence, and digital competition, for example, Europe will pursue its own European approach while trying to align with the United States, where its interests converge. I mention this because I think it's going to be a template for Europe-US relations under President Biden. Align wherever appropriate, agree to differ where necessary, but without falling out. Let me make a wider point in this context about where China comes in on this. While there is undoubtedly greater scope for collaboration between the US and the EU in a number of areas now that Trump has gone, the EU will avoid simply falling in behind a US confrontational approach to China. You know, there are many areas where we are far apart from China in policy terms, but that is not the same as wanting to go to war with China. Europe doesn't want a Cold War or any other sort of war with China. Although we have deep differences on ideology, on democratic values, and in our political systems, the European majority rejects a policy of decoupling from China. And to be fair, so does President Biden. But there are political forces who do seek this decoupling. The EU wants to maintain its current approach of cooperation in some areas and rivalry or competition in others. Now, regarding European integration, another important consequence of the pandemic is that for the first time, the EU is borrowing on the debt markets as a single entity, using its combined size and buying power to do so as to finance a huge single recovery and resilience fund. The recovery fund has made the Eurozone a force in the sovereign debt markets. But the fund is limited. You know, it does not make the EU a single fiscal entity, and it doesn't make the euro currency a rival to the dollar, although the EU wants, in the longer term, a stronger international role for the euro, because it wants to offset the power and the international reach of the dollar and the American financial system. Another feature of European policy will be more state-backed action to support strategic industrial and technological goals. You know, in a sense, perhaps I can put it in this way, Europe is learning from China. Some describe China's economy as a state capitalist model, socialism with Chinese characteristics. Well, Europe will remain a market-based economy with free enterprise and a dominant private sector. But to compete with China, and even to compete with America, Europe is seeing a bigger role for the state and for government intervention to match that of China and the US. So it seems that we're beginning to play China at its own game. You could call it, in Europe, capitalism with Chinese characteristics. Let me finish by making an observation, if I may, about the United Kingdom. You know, the UK is a middle power now, out of the European Union, but still on the United Nations Security Council, having to find its new, lonelier place in the world. The UK government has announced a tilt in its economic interests and security presence to what it calls the Indo-Pacific. This is where the British government sees the world's future center of gravity in the Asia-Pacific region, and where a new weight of British diplomatic and economic effort will be applied. It's not clear what practical expression this tilt will have. I would say that overall, in British policy out of the European Union, there will be more continuity than there will be change. You know, the UK remains rooted in the Euro-Atlantic Security Alliance, its main security interest with the US as its closest ally and as a global defender of open societies and liberal democracy in the world. But just to mention to you also, significantly the UK has put leadership in science and technology at the heart of its national security interest. The UK government says that it wants Britain to become a science superpower by 2030. So perhaps China better watch out because Britain is chasing you in the science and technology leads, or at least that's what it would like to do.
Oh, okay, thank you very much. You know, in your argument, you mentioned the decoupling between China and the United States. As far as I learned, months ago, a senator of the United States, a senator from Kentucky, Tom Cotton, and his team created a report on China-U.S. relations. That report is entitled "Beat China." Beat China, targeted decoupling and the economic long war. In that report, the author proposed some policy measures to decouple with China economically as well as geographically. What I'm curious about the response from Europe towards the ideas or policy recommendations from that kind of report. I mean, report of Mr. Tom Cotton.
Well, I think you will find that only a small minority of people in Europe will agree with or want to adopt the proposals of Tom Cotton. You know, the majority view is, as I have described it, not to engage, not to embark on a new Cold War with China. But at the same time, you know, there is concern in Europe about global trade rules and how these are being upheld and how they need to be modernized. There's also concern in Europe about Europe's dependence and over-reliance on supplies from outside Europe. And the COVID-19 pandemic, has highlighted these concerns in Europe and the United States, and they're raising questions about where we go on international trade. I mean, to a large extent, European political choices and policy proposals looking at what they call strategic autonomy, as I mentioned before, these are indirectly or directly made with an eye on China. Renewed US focus on industrial policy at home can be viewed in part as a response to competition from China. The US believes, for example, that it's essential to secure the entire technology value chain, rare earths, microchips, production, investment, and to hold this entire chain in American hands in order to maintain its competitive edge against China. Now, looking at Europe, there is broad consensus in ensuring greater reciprocity, fairness, and equal treatment in trade and economic relations with China. China is now seen very much as Europe's strategic competitor. But at least from the European Commission in Brussels, we see an approach that also acknowledges the importance, the economic importance of maintaining and growing EU-China trade relations. The push for the comprehensive agreement on investment that was signed at the end of last year, reflects that rebalancing economic relations will be pursued through greater market access, through greater economic and trade integration and interdependence, and not exclusively through defensive trade defense policy tools. And although some of the grievances in Europe and the United States about China's economic model and its role in the multilateral trading system are legitimate, I mean, they are appropriate to articulate. In my view, decision-making in Washington and in Brussels should be driven, and to a very large extent will be driven, by pragmatism and not protectionism. I think China can, by the way, help through its own actions in the international trading system and in its policies at home to strengthen the cause of pragmatism and to defeat protectionism. This is shown in the discussions here at the China Development Forum, as it was in the Europe-China dialogue that I moderated between European business CEOs and Premier Li the other month. We need to keep talking, showing where we agree and where we disagree, but finding ways to work together to bring reform, change and modernization to the international trading system and its rule book and how the WTO operates, for the sake of the shared good of all our peoples and the rest of the world. And what I would say to my Chinese friends is what China needs to do in view of the nervousness in the West and elsewhere in the world about China's economic rise and what it implies for geopolitics. I would suggest to my friends in China that they need to ask themselves, what is China doing? And what can China do more to ease these fears that exist outside China? To demonstrate that China is not a threat, that it wants to be a responsible international stakeholder, and indeed will contribute to the international system, help its reform, help its modernization, helped to bring WTO trade rules into the 21st century. In my view, if China was more proactive in advancing the cause of reform and change, so that different sorts of economy, both market-based and state-backed, can exist harmoniously in the global economy and harmoniously within the international trading system, this would do an enormous amount to ease the fears that people in the West and the rest of the world have about China's rise.
Thank you. I'm totally agree with you. You mentioned what we need to do is to, beat protectionism with openness, with practicism. I agree with you. And protectionism will hurt everyone. Nobody can gain from trade protection. And free trade can generate a huge amount of gain from trade, from the division of labor, international division of labor. So we have allowed, to share in this respect. Apart from protectionism, today we are also facing quite a number of challenges and risks. Last month, I read a book written by Oxford, a philosopher from Oxford University, whose name is Toby Ord. The title of the book is Precipice. Precipice means a cliff, very sharp cliff. In that book, he talked about the challenges facing humanity. Three. The most important of the challenges facing the human being are as follows. Number one, climate change. You have already mentioned. Number two is the engineered pathogens. And the third one is artificial intelligence. And in that book, he argued that today we have the power to destroy ourselves. And then in the coming century, the possibility of the human being to destroy themselves is 1/6. 1/6 is quite big. I was shocked by the probability the author has. So, what's your comments on the coming threat or coming challenges facing the world?
Well, I don't think that Mr. Orr is being too alarmist. I mean, I think he's right to draw attention to the fact that in the process of scientific discovery, for example, in artificial intelligence, but in other new sort of technological forces that we're unleashing in the world, we're creating a world for ourselves in which we are giving ourselves the power both to make ourselves better off and to raise our living standards and to create many new opportunities for people. But at the same time, if we manage those forces wrongly, we are equipping ourselves with the means to inflict self-destruction. I mean, if you take, for example, climate change, our rapid economic development is releasing intolerable levels of carbon into the world's atmosphere, and this must be contained. We have to react. We have to take very strong policy measures. Without effective international action, the world faces huge threats and dangers from fires in the United States and Australia to floods in China. Now, in my view, when it comes to climate action, and this is a really big subject this year because we have the big international meeting, COP26, taking place in Glasgow in the United Kingdom in November. In my view, the best way to persuade politicians on collective action on climate change is to illustrate the economic benefits of doing so and how to take action on climate in a way that doesn't result in the general population footing the bill, having to pay all the costs. Now, we've already seen huge economic benefit from our collective action on renewables. And renewable energy is now cheaper than fossil fuels in many parts of the world. China has been the great pioneer and trailblazer. We are showing how we can both reduce costs and save money and at the same time save the climate and save the planet. Now, can we reach a consensus this year internationally? Well, I think we're nearly there on the consensus to reach net zero. An international agreement is needed at COP26 on a new Article 6 carbon trading platform. This is absolutely essential for our climate action plan. I think the question isn't will we reach agreement, but when? Because we have to. 6 nations have passed laws formally establishing net zero targets: the UK, Sweden, France, Denmark, New Zealand and Hungary. A further 24 countries have net zero targets, either in policy documents or in proposed legislation, and so on. So a lot of the heavy lifting is already underway. There is currently a need to develop joint rules and regulations to achieve net zero goals. And Europe and China, in my view, should work together to enhance support for businesses that want to act to combat the climate change threat. Premier Li has recognized the significance of this, and that not just energy companies, but also chemicals and technology companies, need to take action. At the Europe-China CEOs dialogue that I mentioned, the one I chaired the other month, Premier Li said that European companies in China have been important for China's development, helping to mobilize and upgrade environmental standards and practices across Chinese industries. But we need to make better use of technology to deal with the climate crisis. Several European companies, including German software company SAP, have developed solutions to make manufacturing smarter. Premier Li has argued that there is an urgent need for more smart manufacturing that can both help improve production productivity and reduce emissions at the same time. The problem, however, is that there are no globally recognized carbon accounting standards for products and services. And again, I think that Europe and China should join forces to drive global standardization for carbon footprint tracking and make it a priority for COP26. I know that China has been criticized by some for not providing sufficient detail about its own net zero plans in the latest 5-year plan. But this should not stop Beijing from reaching its targets. I hope some more specific plans to peak CO2 emissions before 2030 by China will be released later this year. And this should inform the world how China intends to reach net zero before 2060. I think it's a positive development that the Chinese government has mandated climate action by local government officials. But we're very well aware that we need to work together globally on this. And we intend to work together with China, not least on green finances, sustainable finance regulation. This is very important
Yes,
for
yes,
Europe and China to
Yeah,
work
you're
together.
quite right. Yeah, we need to work together, and there are a lot of areas we can cooperate in the future. Of course, climate change and the carbon CO2 emission is one of them. So, okay, thank
Hi, Professor Golden. Are we just testing?
Good to see you, Ms. Lee.
Good to see you. Good to see you. I think we are still. I think we're right on time. Shall we start right now? Great. Great to. Are you currently in the UK in Oxford?
I'm in Oxford.
Great. Thank you.
In my home.
Thank you. Great to see you.
I'm sorry I can't be in Beijing.
I mean, looking forward to seeing you. I mean, in person. Hopefully, in the near future.
Hopefully. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll just do my openings. Then we have roughly 30 minutes. So really looking forward to our conversation.
Look forward to it too.
So hi, everyone. Welcome to our in-depth dialogue. I'm Lisa Xuan, and an anchor with CCTV Business Channel, and I'm also the moderator of this session. This is indeed a very unique time as we enter the new decade and also navigate probably the worst pandemic in our lifetimes. And CDF this year is hosting a series of panels with the goal of helping us navigate towards the next 10 years. And the theme of the session is also appropriately titled, What's Next? The Impact of COVID-19 on Global Economy, Politics, and Society. In fact, we will cover additional topics, including globalization, jobs, cities, inequality, development, and global governance. So I'm very happy to introduce our wonderful guest today, Professor Ian Golden, joining us from Oxford. So a brief introduction of Professor Golden. He's the Professor of Development and Globalization at the University of Oxford. He was economic advisor to President Mandela, vice president of the World Bank, and the founding director of the Oxford Martin School, which brings together over 30 Oxford faculty members to 300 faculty members to address interdisciplinary subjects on global challenges. And he's also a regular keynote speaker at the TED, at Davos, and as well as CDF. So Professor Golden has also published many important works and books in this field, including Globalization for Development, The Butterfly Effect, How Globalization Creates Systemic Risk, and What to Do About It, among many others. And in fact, I learned that his newest book is to be released later this year, and it's titled From Global Crisis to a Better World, which is really, really relevant to today's topic. So I think I would like to pass the mic to Professor Golden for now, just to hear about your thoughts and your takeaways from this pandemic. So I'll leave the next 5 to 8 minutes to you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Lee. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be engaged with CDF. I only wish I was in Beijing rather than in Oxford at this time. This pandemic, as we all know, has been the most devastating event in our lifetimes. I hope it's the last. And the big question is, will it be? Why are we having more pandemics? And how do we stop them? The pandemic was inevitable. I've been arguing since 2014 in my book, The Butterfly Defect, and every year since then, that while globalization, by which I mean the flows across national borders of goods, of services, of ideas, of finance, of people, has been the most progressive force in the history of humanity, it's the reason why so many people have got jobs, why there's been so much investment, exports, tourism, travel, why we've advanced more rapidly. It's brought more progress to more people more quickly than any force in history. And of course, the opening up of China has been absolutely central to this globally, releasing the energy of China for the world, finance from China, exports and imports into China and from China, and has helped poverty alleviation in China in a way that has never happened in history anywhere in the world. So I'm a great believer in globalization, but globalization also, by connecting us in new ways, by increasing population incomes, by increasing the amount we are in proximity to animals, has led to new risks. We saw in the financial crisis of 2008-9 the super spreading through financial centers of a global crisis globally. We see every few days cyber attacks that come through cyber connectivity. And pandemics are inevitable because as more and more people come together at airports, spreading globally, the only question is, where will they arise and how do we stop them? So this pandemic, I hope, will be a big wake-up call. The reason it has been so big globally was very poor management in many places, and the failure of all of us to give necessary attention to the World Health Organization and to supporting pandemic management. What the pandemic will do is accelerate underlying trends. These things were happening anyway, but the pandemic has compressed into 1 year events that would have taken 10 or 20 years to emerge. Economically, what the pandemic has done is accelerate the shifting of the economic center of gravity to East Asia, to China, to South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, all countries which have handled the pandemic much better than Europe or North America, and also handled it better than Latin America and Africa. So accelerating the movement of the economic activity. Asia has embraced globalization, and despite this embrace has done much better. And that's because it's acted more decisively, quicker, it's acted more effectively in managing the pandemic. And we are still seeing in Europe the third wave coming of the pandemic. So you're very fortunate in China to have been able to handle this much better, but also your neighbors have done much better. As the economic gravity focuses on East Asia, a growing share of global economic activity, the growth of Asia will remain much stronger. We will see a quick recovery in Europe and in North America because of the massive stimulus package. $14 trillion of stimulus in Europe, in North America, and other advanced economies. The second big impact of the pandemic is growing inequality. Inequality within countries and between countries. Within countries because some people have been able to carry on working, because they've been able to, like me, work from home. Remote work has been very effective, and of course, if this pandemic had happened only 20 years ago, none of this remote activity would be possible. So technology has facilitated it. But within countries, many people cannot work, and we're seeing growing inequality as a result. We are also seeing growing inequality between countries, and particularly poor countries have not been able to support their people. Less than 1% of the global stimulus has gone to developing countries. And so Africa and Latin America, South Asia, are likely to be devastated by the pandemic. And many people, the World Bank has estimated 125 million more people are likely to fall into desperate poverty. The third big impact of the pandemic is increasing solidarity between the young and old. And what we've seen is young people making remarkable sacrifices for the elderly. Young people are not likely to die from COVID-19. The mortality rate of elder people is something like 100 times greater than of young people. And yet young people have given up their social lives, their education in Europe and in North America, their job prospects because the job market has collapsed, and also are taking on a massive debt for the older generation. And the big question is, how do we repay? How do we look after young people in the future? How do we give them a better future? The fourth big impact of the pandemic is on politics and government. What seemed to be impossible in Europe, in the US, and other countries in January 2020 now seems normal. Governments have said to companies, you will not go bankrupt, and actually bankruptcy has gone down in 2020 and the beginning of 2021. It's paid people not to work, to stay in work in jobs that are not happening, or to be paid at home. Basic income. Governments have increased their deficits in ways that would have been unimaginable. And so there's a big rethink about what the role of governments are and what government economic policy can do in ways that would have been unthinkable only 15 months ago. Firms have also changed dramatically in what they do. And the big question for the future is, does this continue? The governments have got much stronger, and of course, in China, the government was already strong, but in Europe and in the US, the role of government has changed in fundamental ways. On politics, the impact, because of growing inequality, like after the financial crisis, has been to increase populism. We would not have had President Trump in the White House. We would not have Brexit in Britain, which in my view is a very, very negative impact on Britain and on the world, if it had not been for the financial crisis. These crises make people angry. These crises where inequality grows, where the economy does not recover, lead to growing support for parties of the extreme right and left in Europe and the US. And that is very dangerous. And we saw, although President Biden defeated President Trump, we saw 10 million more people supporting President Trump, 74 million people in the election in November. And that, I believe, reflects the fact that unless Europe, the UK, the US provide jobs and provide a hopeful future, we will not be able to escape crises. The final point I'll make before we open for discussion is I hope this pandemic has taught us the importance of solidarity, not only inside our countries to create a stable future, but between countries. Global cooperation is more important than ever. The pandemic reflects a failure of global management. We must stop global pandemics, and we can. But also, the institutions that are responsible for climate change, for world trade, for world support in the IMF and the World Bank, in finance, have been not reformed, are not fit for 21st century purpose. And the tensions, and particularly the US withdrawal under President Trump from the international scene, withdrawing from the WHO, withdrawing from the climate agreement, starving the World Health Organization of necessary funding. These have been extremely detrimental. And I hope the pandemic has taught us that no country is safe unless we are all safe, that we have no future as humanity unless we work together. And it's that lesson which is the most important. And so in my book, I talk about going from global crisis to a better world, because I hope and I believe it will be a wake-up call. It will teach us to cooperate more. It will teach us to have not individualism, I, but more we, not me, but us, that we create more harmonious societies around the world, and that we create a more harmonious global order. That is the hope for the future, that the pandemic is the pandemic to end pandemics. And like the Second World War was the war to end world wars, my hope is that we can create out of this a stronger global order and more solidarity within our countries.
Thank you, Mr. Golding. I like the dose of optimism. And then you definitely touched some very, very profound and interesting grounds, like the economic impact of stimulus, inequality, solidarity between young and old. We'll definitely talk about that as well. And responsible governments, the future of companies and business, and global cooperation. Let me start with inequality, because it has really been at the center of many of your past works and publications. We know that inequality is a very complex issue even before the pandemic, and the pandemic has been widening gaps along many different dimensions, be it, you mentioned gender, income, the ability to access resources, technology, education. How can we really reverse that? I don't see a clear path to really reverse that trend.
Inequality can be overcome, not all inequality, and some inequality will continue to exist, but the growing gap. Part of the reason we've seen such rapid growing inequality is that the technology companies have done extremely well, like the ones that host this teleconference, and around the world, and share prices have gone. We've had this very strange thing that we have the collapse of economies in the West, but we have record stock markets. And so people that own assets already, that own stocks, that are CEOs of tech, have done incredibly well. It's said that Jeff Bezos was making more than $10,000 a second during the pandemic, the head of Amazon. So
it's incredible.
There's many things that can be done. You know, after the Second World War, Roosevelt and during the war, Roosevelt in the U.S., Churchill in Britain, and governments in the West had tax rates of over 75%. But what globalization has done is it's led to a race to the bottom in taxation around the world, starting with Reagan and Thatcher, but austerity. Governments have contracted, and one of the reasons why in Western Europe, in the UK and the US, there's been such a poor handling of the pandemic is that governments have been contracted with austerity, and it's got much worse since the financial crisis of 2008-9. And tax rates have gone down very low, as well as tax havens, places where companies and individuals can locate offshore that pay virtually no tax at all. And of course, unless governments have taxation and income, they don't have the means to redistribute. So welfare has gone down dramatically as well. And we've seen the decline of the welfare state. After the Second World War, people were promised jobs, they were promised free schooling, free health, and education, and that has all gone away. It's contracted dramatically. And so the way to overcome inequality, in my view, is in two principal ways. One is inequality of opportunity. Make sure that everyone has education, everyone has health, everyone gets the same basis for starting. And the second is redistribution. Many people, you have to pay for that by taxing the rich and by taxing companies that are making big profits, by taxing your luxury goods and in other ways. So we can do this, and of course government can provide, as it does in China, as it does with the National Health Service in the UK, but one needs to do it more. One also has to accept that you have to overcome discrimination. You mentioned gender discrimination, but equally race discrimination, discrimination against the young or against the old, against the disabled, because unless one overcomes discrimination, you cannot create a level playing field. Yep. You cannot create a world in which people are able to thrive. And even if you have a level playing field, you need to help those that are stuck with one arm tied behind their back and are unable to race as effectively. So we need more caring societies, more redistributive societies, and not only within our countries, but between our countries. We need more solidarity to poor countries, to African countries, to other poor countries, and of course, that is about global inequality as well as national inequality.
Indeed. Also want to shift a topic a little bit because you mentioned technology companies as well, and also looked into actually one of your recent interviews. You talked about this notion of digital globalization. We know that digital globalization and stiffer competition, as well as protectionism, they are kind of bumping against each other. So it's a very complex and very twist situations. And recently we see in the news that tech companies like TikTok in the US or Tesla in China with their autopilot and their cameras, they're all facing scrutiny. So do you think eventually all these globalized companies, they will have very localized operations or even localized servers and algorithms?
I think we're going to have to manage to ensure that the globalized companies have local responsibility. because if they simply companies of the world, no one is not accountable to anyone, unless we have global regulations, which is also vital, and of course with banking, for example, are being developed. So it is essential, and different countries have different standards, they have different rules and regulations, and we also need to think very deeply about this future of work question. If machines are taking human jobs everywhere, where are the jobs going to come from? So the pace of introduction becomes very important as well in different countries. And that is vital. China has led the world in demonstrating how to overcome extreme poverty and how to deal with ensuring that you can grow rapidly and manage. And of course, that is going to become even more important as one goes forward. These technology companies are advancing rapidly, but there are many, many, many questions that require regulation, including the questions regarding who is responsible, who's liable, and where are they based and where do they pay tax.
Yeah. And the next question, I think I'm really asking on behalf of the younger generation, as you just mentioned, that this solidarity between young and old, and you were talking about how the younger generation, they are bearing some of the responsibilities and the mounting deficit in the future, as well as making some compromises. And with the aging population, I think I was also reading about this in one of your articles, that the median age of a lot of countries will actually double in the near future. So how do we really care about the younger generation or repay them?
We
using
need to
your
care
words?
very deeply, and demographics, as China knows well, really matters. So what we used to think of as being rather exceptional in China, which is low fertility, actually is a global phenomenon. Over half the countries in the world today, including many poor countries and low-income countries, are below replacement level in their fertility levels. That means growing share of elderly people relative to young people, and life expectancy continues to improve. The pandemic has been a blip. So this is a massive issue. Of course, as the older people become a bigger and bigger share of population, they also become more and more politically powerful. In the West, they increasingly dominate the politics. And that political power gets translated into young people having to pay more tax, young people having to work harder to look after elder people. So it's a very significant issue. Unless we deal with it, the young people will get angry. What we saw in Spain, what we see in Italy, what we see in many countries, in the US as well, young people supporting extremists. Because they don't see a bright future for themselves. And it's not only an economic future, it's also dealing with climate change. Stopping pandemics, stopping other global threats is vital for young people. I'm optimistic because young people are increasingly aware. The internet, the information age has made young people much more knowledgeable than I was at their age. They are increasingly aware not only nationally, but of global events. They're showing increasing solidarity. The solidarity they showed towards old people during the pandemic has been simply remarkable. And they are active. They are engaging. We see young leaders around the world, not least young women leaders around the world, which has been inspiring. Young protesters like Greta Thunberg on climate and others. So I think this is a very significant thing, but the elder people need to realize that the future is going to be with the youth. And unless we look after them, unless we let their aspirations be realized, we are undermining our own futures, the society, the potential for productivity growth, and for harmony in our societies. So it's extremely important. And of course, the debt issue you mentioned is also one of significance. We cannot simply pass the debt onto the next generation. And that means that we need to begin to reduce our levels of debt in the medium term if they're not going to do that. But, you know, as someone who's in a university devoted to educating young people, for me, this is absolutely central.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, people just believe in different things these days. If we're talking about a shared future for prosperity, I would assume that we still need some of the most basic consensus around shared values or even the most basic understanding of facts. But these days, it seems that consensus could be elusive. Even simple things like wearing masks could be contentious at times. And people, they read news from different sources. Public discourse are also very fragmented. And we are trapped in our respective information loops. So how can we reach the basic consensus that we need?
Yes, I think it's very, very apparent that the hope of the early developers of the internet, of media, that would lead to more shared information and therefore more shared politics and outlook on the world is severely wrong. We're increasingly in silos, and not only silos, increasing fake news and very, very bad ideas are traveling on the internet, as well as good ideas. So my own view is that this is a battle of ideas that we need to engage, that by withdrawing from these discussions, we do not win them. And one of the problems is that people have become apathetic. People do not engage. If people don't wear masks, we need to convince them that it's not. And finally, what Asians have been doing, or East Asians have been doing for generations and generations, we're beginning to adopt. But they're doing it in Asia. They learned from the tough experience of past pandemics. I hope that this pandemic is a wake-up call. The same with the anti-vaccination movement. Extremely worrying because it affects all of us. I also do think there's a role for regulation. We need to stop fake news. We need to take it off our social media. And I think stopping bad ideas traveling is important. I think we need to make it illegal not to do certain activities that harm all of us. So, how one thinks about this is a combination of argument and societies establishing rules, which are always in our collective interest. And I think the pandemic has focused those discussions and will continue to do so going forward.
And I had the opportunity to get a sneak peek of your new book that's going to be released soon. And there's this one chapter that's really interesting because it says that you will be talking about mental health. I think it's also a very critical one because over the past year or so, a number of my very close friends, they actually experienced very difficult episodes and times, and they were fortunate to seek for professional help or medication when necessary. But oftentimes, these kind of sufferings remain very muted or silent because mental health problems, they're still stigmatized for discrimination or judgment. So I just wonder what you're going to be talking about in your chapter. Can you just give us a quick summarize?
I think the pandemic has had a devastating impact on many people's mental health, but one of the positive features which I focus on is how it's brought this into the public domain. It's made us recognize that people are talking about it, and that's the first step towards doing something about it. It has been isolation, loneliness is a growing problem in many places, not least because of declining families and fertility. And it's one of the many aspects I focus on in the cities, together with the future of cities, the future of work. It's a negative impact of remote work. We come together to be more productive, we come together to be more creative, and we come together to share our views as human beings. That's what made human society so effective historically, coming together, diverse people coming together, sharing ideas. And my hope is that by focusing the spotlight on this, we'll continue to cherish those things that are very valuable going forward, so that this terrible pandemic, which has devastated so many economies in the world, can lead to a better world nationally and internationally.
Yeah, so very quickly, my last question, because you also talk about business and cities for the future. So if you were to paint a picture for the way people do business and work and live in 10 years' time, what would that be?
I think it'll be a hybrid model. I think people will have more flexibility at working from home, but many people cannot. And many businesses need people to be in the same place because we learn through apprenticeship. whether it's in academia or in journalism, in the media, in law, in medicine, in so many different dimensions of occupations. We learn by experiencing with people, often informally, this. And that suffers when we remote. It reinforces hierarchy. It's particularly bad for young people. And many people are at home in circumstances which are not conducive to work. They share a room with other people. They do not have their own office, etc. So I think we'll see a hybrid. Many people will come back, but there will be more flexibility, and hopefully that will lead to an improved quality of life, improved productivity, and contribute as well to a new way of thinking and doing in the future.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Golden. Yes, indeed. I attended so many virtual sessions over the past year, but very hard to find that true apprenticeship you're talking about or making true new friends. So really looking forward to seeing you in person, hopefully next time at the CDF. And thank you very much for all of your insights. It's very brief, 30 minutes, but thank you. Looking forward to that. And also stay safe and sound.
Thank you very much, and to all of you and your listeners.
Thank you. 好，再次感谢大家。
of the BRS, and also before that, he serves the Central Bank of Mexico for more than 10 years. And before that, he was a vice minister for finance in his home country, Mexico, for several years. He also has a very distinguished international career. He was a deputy managing director for IMF, and so we work in the same way, the same institutes for years. But more importantly, Augustine also is the chairman of IMFC, which is really the governing body of the International Monetary Fund. So Mr. Carsten has very rich international experience and also a really renowned central banker and now in the BRS, oversights the global financial risk. So we're very happy and honored to have him and take time out from his very busy schedule to join us today. Hello, Mr. Carsten, how are you?
Hello, Mincho. It's a real pleasure to be with you in this session. It's always great to be with you and to join this very important event.
Thank you. It is indeed an honor and a privilege for me to have this conversation with you. And let's start with global economy. You obviously at the BRS Tower, you oversize the global growth economic situation very closely. So how do you see the growth of this year, 2021?
Well, I am sure that this year will be better than last year. Needless to say, it will be an uneven recovery. Certainly, there are some countries, due to vaccination or due to their success in their strategy to deal with the pandemic, they have made substantial progress. Case in point is China, needless to say. I mean, you reacted very, very quickly. You contained the pandemic. You were very effective. Other countries, like in the US, Israel, the UK, they have been very good at rolling out the vaccination and limiting, I would say, lockdowns into the future. So I think that will make a major difference as we move forward. We have to remind ourselves that this is a recession where, or a slowdown, the one we have seen in 2020, it's a slowdown that where the engine of it or the driving force was the pandemic, and then the measures to contain it. In a way, it's a man-made recession
man-made, given that we needed to lock down to distancing, separation, and so on and so forth, due to the need to contain the epidemic. So in that sense, it is a cycle that will also depend to a large extent how the pandemic is brought under control. Also, it has to be pointed out that together with the measures to contain the epidemic, what has been very, very important is that all around the world there has been accompanying policy measures by the government to smooth out the consequences, and these policies have been quite substantial. I mean, I would say unprecedented in the speed of rollout and in just the massiveness of them. So this, I think, has waken up the possibility of having the two largest economies in the world, the US and China, firing in all cylinders during this year, is something that is not common. And I think that will be a very important engine for growth for the world economy. So I stop here. I have more to say, but I give it back to you.
Yeah, thank you. When we talk about the global economy this year, the one key concern is inflation. Larry Summers spoke strongly publicly, say inflation is coming, will come back strongly. And this morning, Joe Stiglitz say he's not very much concerned about inflation. Even inflation come back, there will be tools to deal with that. The financial market really volatile in the past few weeks because change in the inflation expectations. So how do you see inflation movements in this year, 2021? Do you think inflation will come back and come back strongly, as Larry Summers said?
Well, I think that this is an issue that mostly is concentrated in the U.S. Of course, there has been major macro policies that have been implemented that have led some to be extremely concerned about inflation. At the same time, we need to take into account the starting positions, the starting point. I mean, if we look backwards, for the last more than 10 years, we have been concerned of very low inflation or of extremely low inflation. Central banks have been trying to do their utmost to bring inflation up. Most of the time, inflation has been below the target. And at the same time, what we see is that in the traditional markets where you start seeing inflationary pressures, there are not many signs out there. For example, a key issue for having ingrained inflation is to have a lot of signs from the labor market. But what we see is that still unemployment rate is quite high. The participation rate in the labor market in the US is relatively low. Inflation expectations have been reacting, but not to the point that it can lead you to conclude that it will be a runaway inflation. It is likely that we will see a spike in inflation. And I think here we have to distinguish between different factors. One is a comparison of base, and therefore for statistical purposes only, arithmetical factors only that will show in higher inflation. Second of all, the fiscal impulse, that is what has brought a lot of the discussion, even though it is massive. Certainly it will not be sustained through time. Therefore, that might also generate just a spike in inflation, and it will be brought under control. we have to think that what central banks can do is to contain and control the broad tendencies of inflation. If we recall also the revision of the monetary policy framework of the Fed, giving more weight to achieve a high full employment, the Fed is prepared to tolerate some deviation from inflation. Now, I think what really has been generating a lot of noise in the market is that the market really don't know what this means and how far off the 2% will be. My own sense is that the Fed will be extremely watchful. I am in the camp, and this is not always the case in the camp of Joe Stiglitz, from the point of view that in this case, central banks have instruments to deal with inflation, and I think it will be not a destabilizing factor. Again, we have also to recognize that there is a lot of uncertainty out there. And, you know, if you are in charge of the macro design of your country, you have to assess where do you want to risk the mistake to be made of. And I think it's better in this case to risk it in having a little bit higher inflation than expected than not having inflation at all. Because what is of the essence today is to avoid a relapse in terms of slow growth, to have a relapse in terms of not giving traction to employment creation. So I think that the risks are worth taking, and so I have obviously trust on the ability of the central banks to bring this, to keep this under control.
Thank you for a very solid analysis. And you point out it's really the issue in the U.S. Josh Froman, you know, the former White House chief economist, just mentioned this morning, say, U.S. after this $1.9 trillion stimulus package probably will have more to come on infrastructure investments. So in that sense, inflation is a real concern. But you also made a very good point. You say, you know, at this moment, have a little bit of a high inflation expectation is not too bad thing given the very low level, but we got to watch carefully, and the central bank still have instruments to deal with that. Now, then come to the central bank. You know, when you say central bank still have instruments to deal with that, that's very true because interest rate low, they can raise. But if the central bank raise interest rates, they will shake the market. We all recall in 2013 when Dan Bernanke is tapering in Jackson Hole, right? It shook the whole market in October, and a lot of emerging market currency depreciation more than 20%, the capital flee back to U.S. market. And do you see this type of things will happen again?
Well, you know, both in the taper tantrum in 2013 and the episode we have seen during this year have some similarity. And that similarity has to do with the way markets anticipate events. And I mean, that's why it's called the tantrum. In this case, the tantrum was not so much because the Fed, in this case, as it was in 2013, they sent some signals that they were going to tighten. Here it was more like the stabilization package is so substantial that there will be inflation. So in this case, the market probably would have liked to see some more signals from the Fed in terms of getting ready to normalize. So my own sense is that markets have to listen to the Fed. I mean, it's simple to say, but you know, if we look into what is going on and what is the future that waits for us, I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that both China and the US are firing in all cylinders. That will bring growth. That will bring more economic activity. Yes, that will bring more inflation, and that will bring interest rates to more, I would say, more normal levels. Now, that's the state of nature we want. In the long run, we want to be there, Therefore, what we need to find out is which is the best way to transit from today to that state of nature. And I would say that the way to smooth these things out is just for there to be an effective dialogue between the central bank and the market. Now, the Fed has been very consistent in saying we will be patient. It's not that we are ignoring the problems. We are not ignoring the financial stability issues. We are not ignoring the size of the package. We don't ignore the fact that there might be some pressures. But today, I don't have sufficient information to change my policy. And I think that the Fed will be using of a forward guidance and of its communication to guide the markets to this other state that we all want to be in. So, it's something where hopefully this dialogue between the Fed and the markets move in a harmonious way, and that we avoid a lot of the hiccups.
You mentioned,
Yes,
you
go ahead.
mentioned a very important point. The dialogue between the Fed and the market is important. It's really the game today now. You made this very important point. You say normalization is inevitable, right? And we want the Fed policy move into that way because you cannot stay in zero forever, right? You will normalize. The only things that pass, right? The communication. We don't want to see the shock, right? We don't want to see the surprise. So you also say the market have to listen to Fed, but I guess the Fed also have to listen to the market. This has become the new game now. So for this CDF next year in this deep dialogue, we should invite the Fed and the market come to have a deep dialogue. I think that will be also interesting and important. I think those are very important points you made. Now, when we all concerned about whether and when Fed will raise interest rates, emerging market move first. Brazil, raise interest rates, and Turkey central bank raise interest rates, and actually, it's quite a bit, 200 basis points, and also Russia central bank raised another 75 basis points now. Why is that? Are you concerned about movement?
Yeah. There are here, I would say, two issues to highlight. One, there are very particular reasons in some of the countries that require them to move first. I think that in the case of Brazil, the real issue is that there had a huge fiscal expansion, and that huge fiscal expansion, together with accommodative policies, generating the increasing inflationary expectations. It is a case where inflation expectations have already waken up, and the pressures on inflation are there, and it is very likely that they will end up, the central bank, what is looking is that if they don't act today, the possibility of having inflation much higher than the target is a reality. Therefore, this is precisely an example of when we say central banks have instruments to act. If they see the evidence that the target is at risk, they act. And that's what Brazil is doing today. Also, we we have to realize that emerging markets were benefited substantially by the massive accommodation that took place during last year. I mean, something that is sort of not very common is to see that emerging markets, in the face of a major financial crisis, they managed to bring interest rates down. And that's something that they did last year. And this in the context of relative flexibility. Now, when the market rates are adjusting upwards due to expectations, that of course makes life more difficult for emerging markets. So part of this tailwind that they were facing in the past, now it's probably not going to last forever. Therefore, emerging markets will have to be very watchful. You know, it is likely that they will have to react sooner in terms of monetary policy, and also the space they have for fiscal expansion is more limited. So it is to be anticipated that a prudent macro management by emerging markets would mean that the policy adjustment will take place earlier than in the case of advanced economies.
Thank you. This is a very positive note. And there's a lot of guessing, you know, when markets see those movements, right? They're concerned the movements may reflect some underneath financial weakness or something they don't know. But I think your point is very important, you know, when you see the need, take action firmly, even for the emerging market. I think those are very important because you do have tools, you have to use it. And thank you. I think, yeah, that's very important. Now, BIS is really the global institute to look about financial risk, right? How do you see the financial risk portfolio shift today compared with 2 to 3 years ago or 10 years ago? I mean, banking sector risk reduced, we all know that. And also, we know household risk is also reduced. But the sovereign risk increased dramatically. Corporate risk increased dramatically. So how do you see the global risk profile shifting? What wake you up in the midnight? What make you cannot sleep? What are the key risks you are really concerned?
Well, you know, I think. I mean, let me start by saying that yes, financial stability risks increase with more accommodation. I mean, there is no two ways around it. There are forces that have been pushing the search for yield, and you know, of course, that manifests itself in some asset mispricing. You know. Now, I would say from 10, 12 years ago to now, the surveillance capacity of authorities have been enhanced. We don't see major mispricing. There are some aspects that are very visible, but it's difficult to say that this is a systemic issue. I mean, you have developments like in Bitcoin, like with SPACs, like with retail investors in the US, bringing some individual stocks to unreasonable levels. In some markets, you see housing issues, but it's hard to say that we have a really generalized issue in our hands. It requires a lot of vigilance. It requires for authorities to be on the fence, but so far I wouldn't say that it is a dramatic circumstance. There are some aspects that for me are of more concern.
I would say, yes, the increase in corporate debt has been very fast and has been substantial. And this combined with uncertainty in economic development can have an effect as we move forward. So corporate risk, credit risk can be an issue as we move forward. An area where we don't have yet a lot of visibility is how many corporates will really suffer, just because the pandemic will change the reality, and we don't know if the business plans of different corporations will be viable once we have a more normal circumstance. Some months ago, we were very concerned about once the liquidity urgency was over, and once the measures were going to subside, that we would see more solvency problems. So far, this has been avoided, but at the same time, accommodation and support has not been removed massively. And in that way, I think what China has been doing to go gradual to avoid cliff effects is important. But still, we still haven't seen with 100% clarity if the evolution of this cycle geared by the pandemic will be reflected in bankruptcies. So for me, that's an unknown that gives me sometimes not sleeping so well.
I hope you sleep well every night. I think that's also important, not for you, but for everyone in the world, because you are the people has a responsibility about the global financial stabilities. And I think that's a very important point. You say there's in the equity market no major mispricing. I think, but obviously you have to watch. You have to be defensive. I think that's very important point. On the corporate sector, you're right, because liquidity is so good, it's easy for them to refinancing. So some issues we just cannot see today. We have to wait until a little bit later, see how things happen. But as you mentioned, it is a potential risk. Now, BIS also is really championing for innovation in financial sector, particularly on central bank digital currencies. Now, and you issued your rules, your policies, and you support many experimental things. And in Canada, UK, Singapore, and also China also doing experimental things on the CBDC. Why is it important? How do you see the future about the CBDC?
Well, we have to think that the central bank digital currency would represent a third type of a liability of the central bank. Right now, we only have two, which is cash, and the other is the reserves that commercial banks hold in the balance sheet of or in the central bank. At the end of the day, the central bank has to satisfy the need for fiat money of society, and it seems that society wants different type of money. The society seems to be craving for a form of central bank money that is technologically more sophisticated. Of course, that can be derived from the fact that there has been a lot of appetite for other types of money that are probably not, that certainly are not as solid as a central bank digital currency, like, cyber currencies like Bitcoin and so on and so forth. Or there was stable coins have raised a lot of expectations. So I think that central banks need to be ready to satisfy the need for fiat money that society requests. I think that doesn't mean that we need to avoid cash or that we need to limit the use of reserves, but at the same time, it means that central banks should have the flexibility to offer a third type of liability for the benefit of society. At the same time, I have to say that this is not an urgent matter. I think this is the type of thing where we need to go slow because it is very important. Napoleon used to say when he was buttoning up, they were buttoning up his jacket, he used to say to his valet, "Go slow because I am in a hurry." And I think this applies to central bank digital currencies. You have to go slow to make sure that it works. I mean, this is an area where there is no room for mistake. You know, it needs to be secure, it needs to be cheap, it needs to be effective. So I think it is fine that the different countries are taking their time. Something that is quite recognized is the fact that the PBOC started very early in this, probably since 2015-16. And they have gone slow, but they started earlier. Therefore, they have made more progress. But you know, as you have seen how this has evolved, it has been a very painstaking exercise. Looking at every single detail, making sure that there will not be surprises. And also, we have to realize that non-CBDC payment systems that use the infrastructure that central banks provide, the possibility of settling in the central banks, the finality that offers, has given another or really represent another very important avenue through which the needs of society are being taken care of. I mean, the fact that now you have 24/7 instant payments almost all around the world, that's very, very telling, you know, and that also puts some questioning to the fact that this needs to be an urgent development. So, in a nutshell, central banks need to be ready for this, but we don't need to rush into this issue immediately. And here at the VIII, what we're doing is what we always do, which is to be a center for cooperation and collaboration among central banks, in this case, in the particular task of developing CBDCs.
Yeah, that's a very important point. Our time is over. I think we'll probably have to stop here, Augustine. And in this really 28 minutes, we cover so many things. Global economy is recovering, but will be uneven. Inflation is a concern, but very much is in the US, so we got to be careful, watch. Central bank normalizing its monetary policy is inevitable. But the market have to watch central bank, as you say, and central bank have to talk to the market. A dialogue between the market and the Fed is also very important. And for emerging market, if they see the need, take action firmly, also good. I think that you keep a very, very solid and good and the advisors and financial risk portfolio shift, but so far still okay, but we need to be defensive, you mentioned. And the technology innovation is the future, but still long way to go. So you end with a beautiful note. You say, go slow when you are in a hurry.
Yeah.
And the global cooperation is absolutely the key. Those are really so beautiful words. I think it nicely concludes this conversation. Once again, thank you very much to share with us your wisdom, your thought, your view on global economy and the global financial risk issue as well. Please, everyone in the room, join me. A big hands for Augustine Carsten, the General Manager for BIS, and really a great talk. Thank you very much. Looking forward to seeing you in person in Beijing or in Basel, whatever.
Absolutely. That would be great. A real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.